how it was collected is fairly narrative in nature. And even the research and its collection of data is just listed by the research questions that this individual had. So pretty clear, pretty open for most to read and understand. In the second, which is writing towards an engineer audience, again, it's, I would say, fairly easy to understand the overall gist of the research. It doesn't, though, go into some more particular and specific terminology such as transfer studies, metacognition. It uses things like talk alouds, think alouds, and if I weren't somebody who was a member of this discourse community, I may not know what those things are, and they assume that the reader does know that. So there is some lexis in here that might be confusing for the reader, but all in all, fairly easy to understand. And if I were doing an analysis of this, I would actually pull out some portions of this article to kind of show an example of what I'm talking about when I say it's clear, it's concise, or it has, more specific lexis, or the tone tends to be very scientific and robotic, or it tends to be more narrative in nature. I would pull this out as kind of proof and then discuss why I pulled out that particular example, go into a little bit of detail about that example and analyze it and reflect upon it. The other thing that we want to look at is the research topic and the purpose of that research. So as I indicated, both are focused on student learning and teaching approaches for student writing improvement, but the theory and the research that's conducted is very different. So one's very systematic, very scientifically based, while the other is more narrative in nature and very much based kind of on this idea of a particular background of theory when it comes to teaching. And one has very particular data collection methods, analysis, results, methods, and how it connects to its theory, whereas the other doesn't really go into detail about how the data was collected, how it was analyzed, or even in some cases the results. So kind of different approaches. So you'll see that in the first article example, they do go and say, they give a little brief overview of the research that they use to kind of validate their current research problem, and then they list out the 4 research questions that they had. They give a little bit of an indication that they use interviews. They do tell us a few percentages of responses within those interviews. And then they give us kind of like an overview of what all of this means. But you'll see that there's really no clearly delineated methods, results section, discussion section that would be typical to the science community, which makes sense, seeing that this is a writing studies audience. However, in some ways, their attempt at conducting research and not using that type of methodology could be seen as problematic, because there isn't a real clear definition of the categories that this individual is looking at when it comes to revision changes. There's not a clear indication of how the data was collected or analyzed, and there's not even like very clear kind of visual representations of the results from that. So in one sense, you could see why this is written the way that it is, but in another sense, because it is saying or attempting to use a particular type of research strategy, which is qualitative and quantitative, the lack of those categories is problematic. Now, you'll see in the second example of the paper that they give us an introduction, they give us background on the literature, So they give us a very clear theoretical framework for what it is that they propose to study. They give us very particular research questions that they are going to look at, and then they tell us their methods, and they tell us that they're using quantitative and qualitative methods for their research and why it's important to do so. They go through and they tell you what they collected, how they analyzed the texts, what they particularly looked at when they were doing an analysis. They tell us that they used group talk aloud protocols. And talk aloud protocols is a method in which you interview somebody while they're conducting a task, and they say what they're doing at each step so that you could further uncover their thinking processes. They tell us which assignments that they looked at, that they debriefed faculty, that they interviewed their students. They use intercode reliability, which is actually very important when one is coding subjective materials such as interviews. This means that the researcher had an outside source who was in no way connected to the research, who also coded the material to make sure that the two codes, the one by the actual researcher and the one that was the outside reader, matched, to try to take subjective materials and make it more objective in nature. They tell us who the reading team was, how many texts they looked at. So there's a lot of details here, a lot of details in their results. They even tell us what the responses were from the interviews, which we don't get in the first article. We have tables of the data, and then we have tables of their statistical analysis, which as somebody who's in the sciences, or even who would be expecting to read any type of qualitative and quantitative research, would expect to see these types of visual representations of the data. And then they do have a discussion section where they discuss what all of this means. So very different in the types of structure of writing, right? And the methods in which they conduct their research. So that would be something, and again, here I would probably be pulling out examples of these so that I could kind of give proof of these differences and similarities and be able to then analyze and reflect upon what this says about the two different discourse communities and how they conduct research, how they structure their writing, and how this structure of the writing, their format, style, topic, and structure all says very specific things about that discourse community and its goals, the way that it represents knowledge, its belief systems, how they believe research should be communicated to what audiences. And then you want to end with a conclusion where you discuss the difference and similarities that you found, what that allowed you to understand about genre conventions and therefore communication of very particular sets of knowledge and belief systems in these two discourse communities, and your discussion of how genre conventions, genre styles are not some kind of randomly assigned structure in each discourse community, but rather very actively produced and replicated and used in order to communicate very specific goals, knowledge, expertise, and belief systems within those discourse communities. Again, if you have any questions or if you'd like to go over your articles and your initial analysis, you can send me an email. We can meet either virtually or face-to-face, and certainly email me with any questions that you may have.